Hi there and welcome to another Mr. Carter Science Special. This video is on water pollution and in particular the process of eutrophication. As always, keep your eyes out to see the specifications as we go through and the learning outcomes. So on this slide we've got a clear indication of three different types of water pollution. We've got water pollution caused by rubbish here, and in this particular case a gentleman wading through a river in Jakarta dealing with plastic. In fact, you can see that he's trying to recycle a number of plastic bottles. This is of course something which is a very sad, very tragic and very dangerous for this person. If he gets a small cut, the number of bacteria that are living in that polluted water that could infect him and cause a serious illness or even death. It's quite a high risk profession for him, but it's something that people will do out of necessity, need and poverty. A different type of water pollution is shown here, and this comes from the Gulf of Mexico from the BP oil spill in 2010. And again, this is an oil spill that damaged the ecosystems, caused a lot of damage and death to the species of marine life and birds that live in the Gulf of Mexico. But a more common kind of pollution that you see across the UK and in other parts of the world is shown here, and this is showing us eutrophication, where the oxygen levels in the waterway fall so low that there's only a small number of species that can survive in those incredibly low oxygen levels. So again, we have a great loss of biodiversity. So how are these types of pollution caused? Well, in particular, eutrophication is often caused by raw sewage. And raw sewage contains urine and feces, toilet paper, detergents, oil, and also nutrients and bacteria. And it's those nutrients and bacteria that can do some of the most damage. Untreated sewage can cause eutrophication, and also it can cause viral diseases such as polio. Now the polio virus, if it gets inside your body, it would damage the nerve cells in your spine and it can stop you being able to walk and cause paralysis. Or if it damages the nerve cells further up in your neck, it can actually stop your respiration, your breathing system from working, so the muscles in your ribs can't respond to messages from your brain and you can't actually breathe in and out, and it can kill you. Terrible disease. So it's very, very important, if we're going to try and prevent these diseases and prevent this process of eutrophication, that we treat sewage. And grit screens which remove stones, and trickle filters or activated sludge using microbes allow the nutrients that are in the sewage to be removed, and we can also filter any waste. What would that look like? Well, here we've got a diagram showing us what happens in a sewage farm. And we've got a rotating sprinkler system here, which is pouring raw sewage sludge over a number of stones which are covered in microorganisms. And what you might notice from this system is that those stones do not fit neatly together. There are a large number of air spaces between the stones. So if I sort of colour in some of those air spaces there in blue. And these air spaces are very, very important, because what we're trying to achieve here is that the microorganisms on the surface of these stones can feed on the nutrients from the sewage and prevent those nutrients from washing into the waterways. And in order to do that, those microorganisms have to carry out aerobic respiration. So what we're trying to do is, in all the layers of this particular sewage farm, we're trying to make certain that we've got a high amount of oxygen within the system to allow the bacteria to carry out aerobic respiration. So you can see over here the full description. Microorganisms on the stone will feed on organic matter in the sewage to encourage aerobic respiration in the microbes. The sewage is sprinkled through the air. That could be one mark in an exam. There are air spaces between the stones and a thin layer over a stone so that we get an efficient diffusion of oxygen into all of those microbes within those layers. There is also a slow flow of the effluent coming out from the sprinklers, again so that we get efficient diffusion of oxygen. Now, a treated sewage is safe enough to pass into a river and it will not cause eutrophication, because eutrophication, the first step is to have those extra nutrients from the sewage washed into a river. What else could cause some of these water pollutions? Well, we've seen here we've got oil or just normal household waste causing pollution, but also pesticides and fertilizers, and in particular fertilizers from farmland, can also be linked in with water pollution. So how does farming contribute to water pollution and eutrophication? Well, the soil contains mineral ions, and in particular an ion called nitrates, and these are taken up by plants and they are normally replaced when the crops die. But if the crops are removed and sold, then the mineral ions they contain can't be returned to the land, and over time the land will become less and less fertile, and the yields that the farmer will get from the land will become smaller and smaller. So the farmer needs to replace the minerals taken out from the land by their crops, and to do this, farmers will add fertilizers to the soil to replace the mineral ions and nitrates, and this will allow the healthy growth of crop plants. However, these mineral ions and nitrates can easily be washed out or leached out of the soil into streams and rivers, causing this process of eutrophication. So what is eutrophication? Well, as I've already mentioned earlier in the video, the end process of eutrophication is a reduction in the amount of oxygen dissolved in the water, and this can have a disastrous effect on the biodiversity within the waterways. For example, larger organisms that need a large amount of oxygen to survive, like fish or mayfly larvae, will not be able to live in an oxygen poor environment. So the biodiversity of the ecosystem will decrease. But what kind of nutrients will cause eutrophication? Well, in particular, we're looking at phosphates and nitrates, and we find those both in fertilizers and in sewage, which can easily be washed into rivers, streams and lakes. So pause the video right now and just copy down this gap fill, and let's see if you can understand exactly how the process of eutrophication occurs. What would those nutrients, those nitrates, those phosphates do to the different species living within the waterway? Well, here's the answers. Farmers will add the nitrates and fertilizers to the field, and the nitrates are then leached or washed out into the rivers and lakes. And then any algae in the environment will feed on these nitrates and their population will increase. This is called an algal bloom. You can see an algal bloom here in this picture. Now the algal bloom will block out the light, so any plants that are living on the bottom of the waterway, surface dwelling plants, sort of on the surface of the riverbed, they can't photosynthesize, and so they're going to die. Then bacteria and decomposers will feed on the dead algae and plants, and these bacteria will respire and use up any oxygen that's dissolved in the water. So the oxygen levels in the water will decrease. Animals and fish that live in the water will also die. The bacteria will feed on those animals and fish and respire and use up even more of the oxygen that's dissolved within the water. And so over time the biodiversity of the area will decrease as the oxygen levels decrease, and you'll end up with a sterile, almost dead environment of a waterway with an algal bloom on top, but almost no oxygen dissolved within the water, and this is known as eutrophication. How can we find out about pollution levels, and in particular oxygen levels in rivers and streams? Well, scientists could go along with an oxygen probe, but a more common method is to look at the species that are actually living within the ecosystems. These species are often called indicator species. Why? Because they give you an indirect measurement of the amount of oxygen that's in the waterway. They indicate oxygen levels. Now, different invertebrate species need different amounts of oxygen to survive. For example, a mayfly larva here will need a large amount of oxygen to survive. So if you sample an environment and you find a large amount of mayfly larva in that environment, it indicates that there must be a lot of oxygen dissolved within the water of that river system. However, if you find the exact opposite, the worms down at the bottom, in particular often bloodworms, they can survive in very low oxygen environments. So if you're finding through sampling methods that you are collecting a large amount of bloodworms but not so many other invertebrate species, again, this indicates that there will be a very low level of oxygen within that water system. And as you can see here on this graph, when we have low levels of oxygen, that's associated with high levels, in this case, of sewage effluent. And again, it's the sewage and the nutrients that are contained within the sewage that can cause eutrophication. You'll also notice that when we have clean water here, that's associated with having lots and lots of oxygen, and we've got clean water animals living there and very few bloodworms, compared to when we had the bloodworms living in high numbers when we had a large amount of sewage within the waterway. So if we have a look at this water system here, and I'll just make it easier and colouring very quickly blue the waterway so you can see it travelling down here. So here is our waterway, or our river and stream, travelling from A to B and then from B to C. And as the river is travelling, it passes two different areas. It passes a sewage treatment plant after A but before B, and after B but before area C we have a farm. So which area of the river, A, B and C, is going to have the least amount of oxygen? Which species would you expect to live there? Well, before the sewage treatment plant at A, we'd expect to find a lot of water shrimp and a lot of mayfly larvae, as these are species that require a large amount of oxygen to be dissolved within the river. After a sewage treatment plant, we would expect to see a small decrease in this, because although the sewage should be treated, there may still be a small amount of nutrients within that the effluent that's coming out of the sewage plant and being carried away in the river, so we may see a small decrease in oxygen. But actually it's area C after the farm where we would expect to see the biggest decrease in oxygen, because all the fertilizers that the farm is using will often be leached directly into the river system, causing eutrophication, causing a decrease in oxygen within the water system. So in most cases we'd expect to see lots of water snails and lots of bloodworms down here. I hope you've enjoyed this video on eutrophication and water pollution. If you have, please like and subscribe to the channel, and perhaps share it with people in your school, in other years of your school, so that this resource can be used more widely than it currently is. Thank you very much for watching,